So we're going to switch gears a little bit now and shift to a panel discussion with speakers that we just had. We're also going to have Michael Esbon from Van de Esbon Studio, who is a designer looking at the relationship between a lot of the techniques and technologies we just studied and how they affect the public realm with a specific focus on the Great Lakes region. So you guys want to go ahead and sit down? Tim Neely from our group is going to be kind of leading the discussion, but we're certainly going to be welcoming audience questions and things like that. So, yeah.
So I'll sit here out of the way. So if you guys want to sit, yeah.
And again, don't forget to lean into your mics.
So as I'm sure you're noticing, every time we touch the table, produces that delightful resonant drumming sound. So please be careful. So what I thought we would do, this is Michael, is a designer and he's not from New York. And so we thought it would be interesting to hear, after he sat through these presentations, his responses and reactions. So I'd like to open with that. Then we have a couple of questions that we wanted to ask the panel, but we also very, very much want to hear from you guys. So please do raise your hands and jump on. We'll start with Michael.
Great. Everybody hear me? Good. Well, thanks everyone. It's great to see everybody turning out. Thanks to the organizers of the event. And then thanks again for these three great presentations. Just as an initial part of a response, I think it'd be worthwhile to just situate the design disciplines relative to dredging. We haven't heard from a designer yet today, and we will later. It might be get a few sentences behind specifically how landscape architecture has begun to be kind of newly engaged with processes of urbanism, the production of energy, the production of food, waste disposal, and of course dredging. And I think that one of the challenges then of designing within landscape is kind of the integration of dredging processes as a spatial practice, as a kind of process, the integration of that with craft in the public realm. And so, given that as just kind of a framework, one of the things I appreciated about all three of these presentations is they introduced the idea of scale. Lisa offered a great anecdote about the amount of dredging relative to the size of Central Park. Andrew offered us a kind of economic perspective, economic scale, and of course Richard broadened our horizons, thinking way back in time and offering that kind of temporal scale. I think that dredging, for me, can be one of its more kind of interesting agencies is that it can be a very visceral way of understanding scale of sedimentation, scales of erosion, which can be very imperceptible. It can obviously erosion can have very dramatic effects. Other times it can be barely perceptible. But in kind of exhuming sediment, that process of kind of gathering it and then either spraying it on shorelines or layering it into disposal areas, we're kind of confronted with volumes of it. And my work in the Great Lakes, I'm doing research on what's actually the largest confined disposal facility of contaminated sediment in the Great Lakes at a place called Point Mouillet, about 10 miles south of Detroit. And it's interesting, in the Great Lakes, there's about 3 to 5 million cubic yards dredged per year. And about half of that is contaminated. And what they do there is they sequester it. They just basically put it into types of landfills, actually. These are not mounds. These are artificial islands, artificial peninsula that they kind of craft with the Army Corps of Engineers has kind of built over the last 30 years, and they're depositing contaminated dredge there. And these are just fascinating landscapes. And again, they give you a very strong sense of the volume of sediment actually shedding off of these agrarian landscapes that surround the Great Lakes. So you won't be surprised to know that we have the technology to measure sediment collection in harbors down to the centimeter using remote sensing technologies. That same technology can give us a sense of the macro scale of how and help us predict how much sediment is shedding off of land with different land uses like agriculture or industry. But really, I think, to get back to my point, that dredging is an opportunity for a very visceral understanding of the volumes that we're dealing with here. So Point Mouillet, it's called the Big Banana by the local residents there. It's about the size of Central Park. And you kind of have to kind of walk around the edge of it on a dike. And one of the interesting things there that I saw that I'd just like to share is that because the sediment is shedding off of agricultural land, it's freighted with fertilizer. So it's extremely rich. Now that sponsors this kind of spontaneous vegetation when you set it into these confined disposal landscapes. And so, Lisa offered an image of how we're kind of planting some of the places in Jamaica Bay. But at Point Mouillet, I was looking at a 20-year forest, cottonwoods, 4-acre forest, and just one little part of this massive island was just completely spontaneous vegetation. They just let it go, and let it grow, and it has all kinds of its own ecosystems and whatever else. So these aren't always kind of just like kind of lunar, muddy landscapes. Sometimes they're actually very rich with vegetation, biota, and flora as well. I just want to offer those thoughts at the start.
So, sort of some small questions. Question number one is, as I've been looking at the Jamaica Bay Islands or the other places where we're using, and I've been wondering, who decides on the shape of those islands? How did the shape that you're aiming towards get decided?
Basically, it's based on a historic footprint. And so one of the interesting things about Jamaica Bay is that we are allowed to take dredge material and put it in the water. And I think that's a unique thing, as you were talking about Great Lakes. I mean, that is a hot button issue here. What makes Jamaica Bay unique is that it has that historic footprint of those marsh islands that have eroded. And so we basically look at the 1974 footprint from a regulatory-driven action and look at what we're allowed to build out to. And so we do not exceed that particular historic footprint with the dredge material. And so our designers basically determine how much volume can go to each one of them based on the elevation that would basically create the low and the high marsh that's out there. So. And
when your designers sort of figure this stuff out, I mean, do they spend time thinking about what it's going to look like now or 20 years from now?
Oh, yeah.
Sort of irrelevant?
It's very relevant, and we have these conversations very frequently. And right now we just finished creating 44 acres at Yellow Bar, and we're right now pumping onto Ruler's Bar. And one of the interesting things that changes constantly, I mean, it's based on subsidence and the erosion rates and looking at that sustainability. And so we try to project out as to what it's going to look like based on all the lessons learned and historically what data has been collected in Jamaica Bay and how the other islands have worked. But there's so many factors going on, and we try to do the best we can. But we also look at well into the future for sea level rise and look out and basically accommodate the high marsh versus low marsh ratios and elevations based on that very future outlook.
Just to add to that, in addition to having the proper ratio for high and low marsh, we touched on earlier too, I saw in our presentation about climate change. So we consider that within the design itself. And the core belief in that does consider climate change sea level rise and anything it does build, so we're happy with that. But especially with the restoration, we see that it does proliferate. But another regulatory hurdle we deal with too is FAA, near airports. Now there's the issue of having wildlife strikes away from the airports that will not bring birds that could be problematic. And secondly, we design it so it's not really nesting habitat or low-thing or breeding habitat, not breeding habitat, feeding habitat, so we stop over. And one of the things we noticed through our monitoring is that we actually pulled some of the birds away from the airport islands that are in there. So that's the hope. So that goes into part of the design also.
Peter Webler, Corps of Engineers, technical lead engineer for Marsh Islands.
Let's talk a little bit about Sisyphus, who, if there was any mythological figure who we would take on as our patron saint, I think it would be Sisyphus. Andrew, you talked a lot about the cost and the different kinds of costs. Are there trends in those costs? Is it getting cheaper per cubic yard or more expensive per cubic yard?
I would say it's been holding steady remarkably over the past decade. We've been seeing better costs more recently. I think that people are kind of scaling up and appreciate this material is being used as a resource, but still, in terms of a dramatic decrease for the contaminated dredge material, we haven't seen that yet. We're still searching for that.
And so, what kind of things are you hoping for?
Well, I think one of the things we're hoping for is to just do less with the material, because that's where the costs lie. When you do these mixtures with Portland cement to use it as a construction material, there's a lot of added cost to that. So whether it's different admixtures that are less expensive, that's one option, or just using the material closer to its raw state in a beneficial way, in a managed way, for either economic or environmental projects would be our goal.
I hope all of you will answer this question because I'm very curious about it. Towards the end of Roger's presentation, he talked about the specific problem, which is that if you cut a channel that's closer to a straight line, it speeds up the movement of the water, it speeds up the rate at which it gets filled back in. To what extent does that impact your planning? Is this new information, relatively new, or where does this kind of realization fit in? So I guess, Roger, if you could start, and then I'd love to hear all the way in.
Well, of course, I'm not involved in the planning aspect of it, but this was first brought to my attention by a former faculty member at the University of Minnesota, Alvin Anderson, who commented that how can we work this dredging operation so it works as much as possible with the river rather than against the river. And I don't know whether he ever came up with a solution, but each bend in the river would have a different, would be a different question to study. You can't generalize too often from one bend to another.
I guess my contribution would be if we were designing the port now, knowing what we know, we probably would do things differently given those costs. But since we have a fully mature, metropolitan area with our ports really concentrated in just a few places in Newark Bay, the Upper Bay, with a lot of sunk cost in that infrastructure. That's where I think the tension begins, and we also have bridges that may be too low that need to be raised in certain areas, like the Bayonne Bridge. So I think if we lived in a perfect world, we could redesign it. But now I think what we're trying to do is do the best we can with what we got, as my grandmother would say, right? But I think we are mindful of where we can design new facilities so they're closer to deep water, where dredge is minimized. One last thing quick is when we thought about the right location for the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal in Red Hook, for example, we put it on a marginal berth off the Buttermilk Channel because we never have to dredge there. So that's just over the last 6 years or 7 years.
And does there come a point where the sort of increasing cost of dredging tips over, and at what point does New York just rewrite does it, or is that just not? Has that ship sailed?
We're not there yet. A lot of ships have sailed, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I had mentioned this before, as we're dealing with those high costs, what's going to end up happening is, dredging will be minimized just because we won't have the money to actually get it done. And so hopefully we'll be able to maintain the port and be able to keep the ships coming in. But, if we don't find those alternatives that are going to decrease the costs for non-HARS material, then we are going to be stuck with dredging a lot less and having issues. And just thinking very strategically as to what gets dredged, what are the critical points that we're going to have to be focused on in the future.
Is there a HARS capacity? Does that site eventually reach a capacity, or is it being...
Eventually. I think we have, how many more years do you think we have? Well, actually, we'll wait for Doug. We can wait for Doug's talk. He is in charge of the HARS, basically.
Thank you.
No problem.
Can I say one? I wanted to add, because I think I come from an urban and regional studies background, I guess. That's my background, my degree. And one of the things that I think we're hoping to accomplish here by having vibrant port facilities and having, a thriving harbor is to reduce carbon footprint, because, ships are many times more efficient moving a ton of whatever than are, airplanes or trucks or even railroads. And they are getting better and better, because the rules governing the emissions, the air quality emissions, are getting stronger and stronger worldwide. So I think having a vibrant New York region involves having vibrant ports, and if you want to say stop the suburban sprawl, making a place like New York City, Jersey City, Newark more livable places, where lots of people can live because we have that scale, and take the pressure off the hinterlands, I think really does involve having a better supply chain to feed and clothe and do all the things that we do. And so that's just I think something that I think has to go into the equation about dredging.
And Michael, the project you're involved in, they're highly motivated to dredge because they're dredging contaminated material.
Yes, right. And obviously, just like here, discontinuing any dredge activity is going to have economic effects. The crisis in the Great Lakes is that these contaminated disposal facilities have a certain capacity, and they're very expensive. So the question is, and I think that Andrew's kind of raising this a little bit, is how can we begin to, well, let me just back up and say that in the Great Lakes, I've heard some of the beneficial use initiatives that are going on here. Those are not very well established in the Great Lakes at all. They're just now starting to deal with kind of separation of fines and coarse materials and sending those things out for construction, for wetlands, habitat reuse, things like that. So they're much more in this vein of kind of landfilling this stuff. But as I just mentioned, there is capacity to this, and so there's a big question mark right now. We're at a critical point where the question is, do we put more money into essentially raising the sidewalls of these artificial islands so you can put more dredge in? Or do we really put money into these kinds of initiatives that would, upland initiatives, right, that would prevent erosion in agrarian landscapes and deal with different ways of managing construction sites, which is where a lot of sediment sheds off.
Do you have an opinion?
Do I have an opinion?
What they should do?
Yeah, my opinion is the latter, only because it offers a number of different ways that we can engage the public in terms of creating initiatives, creating landscapes, creating opportunities, economic opportunities around this issue. Landfilling essentially just feels like an old school solution that's very limited and costly. So I'm for kind of new opportunities for engagement.
I'm noticing a lot of nodding, so I'd like to hear about that, and then I'd like some hands to start going up.
I mean, New Jersey has had to handle the Upland Beneficial Use, the capping of landfills and brownfields. I just have to give a shout out to Rich Dewan, who's here from former New Jersey DEP, that basically trailblazed the whole beneficial use. And I mean, if we didn't have the mud dump site shut down, the HARS, material would still be placed similar to other areas in the United States. That just, it's cheaper ocean disposal, and so you just have to find those solutions. And so as becomes much more unpopular, and you just force. And now New York has been, so much has been done to push New York to find these sites as well. And so, even though they might be more expensive, you have to look at the beneficial aspects of it with closing landfills, stopping leachate, and creating great malls and golf courses and things like that. Great benefits.
I just think it's important to also note that as we are dredging, we are getting contaminants out of the system, and that a lot of these were put in through long history of impact, up and down the estuary, and that hopefully we get to that day where the costs are lower because we are taking more to the HARS, or we have much more ability to use material beneficially with less touching, and because the contaminant, we finally got to that point where the contaminants are lessened.
Yes, sir. Speaking to what Andrew just said, I think that was so key, because when the New York State Department of Environmental Protection was first founded and the Clean Water Act was first passed, there was the quality of the water here in New York Harbor is vastly different, and I mean worse, than it is today. And that's tied to two very key things. One is New York State has the Hudson River Estuary Program, which has done so much to clean up the upper river and to really reach out to people and talk to them about what's important on the waterfront, what should you do and not do. And through the dredging that we've been doing down here, what you find is projects that are dredged regularly, either annually or biannually, such as the passenger ship terminal, do pass to go to the HARS because that is new deposition. That is not historic deposition. It's the historic deposition which causes the problem of now what are we going to do with this material?
Can I just...
I'd just like to make 3 quick points about it. Number one, you're not really talking about a dredging issue in New York. You're talking about a disposal issue. It's disposal driven. And when you talk about things like the HARS, Jamaica Bay, these are all great things. But that's using sand. And sand does not accumulate the contaminants. It's the finer grains. And sand doesn't have a problem for disposal, because if we're not beneficially using it, we can find a couple hundred other uses for it. So that's not really the issue. The issue is the material that's accumulating in the channels, which is the fine grain material. That fine grain material is what accumulates and has the contaminants bind to it as particles. And the last thing I want to make is kind of building on Katie's point, which I hope we hear some more from the audience, is the definition of what's contaminated, what's clean, can change from county to county, from state to state, from region to region. More importantly, it changes from where it sits, whether it's in the water, whether it's upland, or whether it's part of another compound. So the definition of what is determined clean, what's contaminated, because it has so many different scientific meanings and is so poorly understood, has been politically manipulated by various groups to promote their agendas. Those agendas have, unfortunately, shut down a lot of positive discussion that could contribute to other options that are no longer on the table. Folks, nothing is going to go after the HARS with the cleanest of clean. I apologize in advance to my friend over there, Mr. Doug Cox. HARS isn't an option for the material that's being generated that needs to be at home for it. It just doesn't work. You've got to find other options.
I just want to follow up one little quick thing. Because what has been studied a lot is figuring out where the hot spots are so that we can eventually get to HARS suitable material. And so it's just critical that the Hudson's cleaned up, that the Passaic River's cleaned up, and some of these other hotter contaminations, so we can get to the place that it's cleaner so that it's suitable, and be able to make it more manageable from an economic perspective to dredge and dispose.
And the key is if it's suitable for the horrors, it's suitable for a bajillion other uses as well.
Totally. Much more restoration opportunities.
More options, the cheaper it's going to be, the more economically development can occur along the waterway.
So although everyone apparently wants to talk about disposal, I was going to ask about actual dredging.
Sorry.
But I thought your sort of taxonomy of the types of instruments that get used in this it's kind of interesting, and I wondered, clearly there's a lot of focus on innovation in how do we dispose of stuff. Is there focus on innovation in how we actually scoop it out in the first place? And is there any way of making that less mechanical? I mean, could you design water flow in such a way that it would scour forests? Or is that ridiculous? Probably.
I can
Start with the
Sure. I can speak to that a little bit. There is a competition that the City of Toronto put on for the Don River, the kind of revitalization of a post-industrial landscape there in the estuary. And the winning competition entry was from Michael Van Valkenburg Associates. And they worked with hydrologists and limnologists to create what was called a sediment trap. It was slightly upriver from the development area. And what it was essentially a kind of basin that was cut into the base of the river. And as sediment flowed down through the river, it would naturally kind of separate. Fines would shed over the basin. Sand would deposit within it, where it was then it became a stockpile as a kind of usable construction material. And fines were kind of sent downriver, and they were allowed to accumulate into kind of naturalistic kind of landforms. But it was a really interesting kind of passive solution to the separation and the sequestration of stuff. It didn't kind of completely eliminate the need for dredging, but it was part of a process of setting up a substrate for the urbanism that was to come. So sediment was really kind of a key, kind of integral part of developing that land. I thought it was quite interesting.
I also have a comment or answer to your question, which actually is much earlier than the Buckberg example. In around 1880, James Eads won a competition as well to design an entrance to the port of New Orleans. And he actually had done the same for the bridge in St. Louis, the bridge that crosses the Mississippi there. He had spent a lot of time on the bottom of the Mississippi and wetsuit. And he knew the bottom very well. And he actually realized that he channeled the water just as Professor
Roger Cook.
Professor Cook was talking about how the sediment tends to flow. He realized that you actually create a channel with little mattresses at the bird split of the Mississippi Delta. The speed produced by the water moving straight would actually help scour and dredge the river. Unfortunately, I don't think he knew that the continental shelf was right there, so all of that sediment was dumped in the continental shelf instead of forming land. He actually used a very passive and sustainable creating dredge.
The one technology that we've heard of is we have some kind of blower system alongside a pier that can put just enough energy into the water column to keep the sediment from falling. But the issue is always, where does the sediment go? So it's if that's a solution, it may be, but it's you have to manage the entire life of the sediment.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember this, Andrew. I used to work for New Jersey DOT. That we did a pilot on numeric barriers, where it was that whole bubbling and that concept. And I'm sure there's a report on the New Jersey DOT website of those results. I can't remember them, but they're not being used anywhere, are they? In the harbor, or?
It was one that I used.
Yeah, is that where the pilot was? So, I mean, I guess I have a feeling, oddly reminiscent, that they weren't as effective, that we're not using them throughout the harbor, but to stop the sediments of the sediments from getting in the channel to begin with, and we don't have to dredge it. So that was a great idea.
Also, the idea of the sediment sediment basins or sediment traps are used in a lot of the inlets for maintaining in order to lengthen the duration between maintenance cycles. So to get as we were saying, money when it comes far in between, get enough of the budget, you can actually increase your dredging by putting the sediment basin in, and it actually traps the material not going into the inlets, but it takes a little bit longer.
There's been advances in the technology of sediment trap, and we've seen a lot of them in the Great Lakes, where some of the ports are gambling on that technology as resurrecting tools. And it is very, very early, but it's showing some promise.
I can actually speak to that a little bit. In Cleveland, Ohio, we're actually pulling the Streamside System is the company that makes these things. Generally, it's actually a manufactured process where they've realized, as it's been stated, the bed load is primarily sand, and the sand is actually clean. And so most of them is all the clean sediments basically on the bottom. And so if they can pull out this clean stuff from the bottom, they can use it in, say, construction processes if they're building something, which of course is a problem in the Great Lakes. So there's lots of piles of sand just waiting for a place to go, and companies that don't have anything to do with it. But there are cities like Toledo also are looking at these types of systems that will again pull the sediment off the bottom. The other thing that I hope we talk about today is that there's a significant difference in the composition of sediment as well. So depending on what you want to do with it, the Maumee River, where some of my work is now, is looking at Maumee's the kind of most biologically wealthy river in the whole Great Lakes region. It's also the most nutrient rich, so there's lots of phosphorus in the water, and that's what creates algal blooms and hypoxia issues that we have in Lake Erie. But that sediment doesn't have a lot of sand in it, so you can't use it for construction, but it has enough phosphorus that in Cleveland they're wishing they could use it to basically fill in basements and stuff that could, it actually helps bind lead. So they're trying to figure out ways to address it with the issue of shrinking cities there. Then of course in Cleveland, the stuff doesn't have any nutrients in it at all, but it has a lot of sand in it. So I think that the composition here in New York would be interesting to think about in terms of how we reuse it. So I hope we learn a little bit more today about just what the sediment is like here, like more physically.
It's not full of phosphorus, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of another way of looking at the term contaminated and how subjective it is. It's all based upon the first and foremost, the composition of the sediment. And then when you test it, what is the criteria you're comparing it against to make a decision? And sometimes that criteria has nothing to do with its use.
I mean, in Duluth, the soil that they pull out of the river, which is contaminated, is twice as clean as the average soil in the city. So it's the idea that like we can't use it in the city, even though it's a lot cleaner than any other soil that's ever tested in the city.
Point being is, all of that should be on the table for evaluation. It should be objective evaluation based on multiple lines of evidence, and not just some regulatory decision benchmark that has to be made in a permanent decision.
I saw a hand in the front here. Was still a hand?
Well, I guess my question is kind of a follow-up question, I think, the question that Michael posed about how to, like, you guys really set up the conversation well here, I think, with the idea of the dredge cycle and where this dredge sediment is actually coming from. But my question is kind of a two-part question of how can New York actually reduce the amount of sediment going to the harbor, which I think has been answered a little bit here, but I was wondering if that's something you're actively pursuing. But also, I'm wondering, just how do you even know where that sediment comes from? Like, what are the ways that you measure sediment within the water? Does sediment come from boat and barge traffic, like stirring up existing material on the ground, or is it mostly coming from upstream?
I mean, there's a lot of our vessels that actually do stir a lot. I love these aerials that show a lot of plumes, but I mean, as suspended solids are being taken off in just runoff and sewers and down our tributaries, we have so much hardened substrate right now, you know. I like to think that reducing the sediment load in the estuary can be changed by building a lot of wetlands. I think that stabilizing the shoreline and bringing back, and we've lost more than 85% of the wetlands and the habitat and everything's so hardened. So everything just heads in. We have no filtration capacity. I think I'm just looking at, you know, from the standpoint of the restoration, that those wetlands can then capture and filter not only and improve the water quality tremendously, you know, from the contamination.
The initiative goes upriver too, stream bank stabilization. lot, all the eroded streams that are in there. And even in the boroughs, like Bronx, in Westchester, down, that's where it all ends up down here.
Yeah,
And that's part of your purview, right? Like that's
Yeah.
part of your mission as well.
Yeah. And I think, if you just take a look at what's going on in New York Bay, it's considered a sink, and so you've got tributaries that are flowing down from Lower Passaic and the Hackensack, and everything is then, being deposited and then, of course, we have to dredge it. And of course, those particular source streams, tributaries that are flowing down, aren't the best of sediments that are then filling in our channels. So that's one reason why we need to cut off those sources, so that we can then improve the rest of the harbor.
Yeah, just a little faster.
Yeah.
We are coming to the end of our time, but there's a couple things that the four of us really wanted to hear a little bit about. One is a factual question that maybe someone can just answer. What percentage of the United States waterways are dredged? And within, the nearest 20%, is it half of them? Is it a lot of them? Like, do you know? Is any?
I can't keep track of New York. New Jersey, the middle of the rest of the United States, so I couldn't even guess.
I mean, generally, most of the dredging, really, and this won't be a great answer, is the East Coast ports dredge more than the West Coast ports. The West Coast ports like LA and Long Beach, which are the largest in the United States, they dredge far less because they just have naturally deep water. In that, what they've had to do is build structures out into the water to protect their harbors, which we didn't have to do to the same degree. But East Coast ports tend to dredge more, as do the Gulf Coast ports, particularly at the mouth of the Mississippi.
Is that the answer?
Whatever it is, it's about to change significantly with the change in the Panama Canal. And that's why all this is happening. The ships are getting bigger, and they need ports to call home that can have deep draft water. So there's a race from Brownsville, Texas, all the way up to Boston, Massachusetts, and maybe beyond, to get deep and to be there for these ships, and they're all in competition with each other. So all along the Gulf Coast, and then up along the Atlantic, all that's going to be changed. Everybody wants to get deeper, not everybody can. So the percentage is about to change from what it is today.
So this is what you're talking about, is sort of the shockwaves that Brett and Rob were discussing. The post-Panamax Canal, so for those of you who don't know this, the size of the Panama Canal determines how wide and how deep a container ship you can build, right? Because we can build very, very large ships on the ocean. There's plenty of room.
And there are ones that don't transit the canal.
Right. And so there are already ships that are too big for the Panama Canal, but because there's a continent in the way, it's very difficult to ship things from Asia to the East Coast of the United States, and Europe, and that kind of thing.
Also, too, I think you have to qualify the question, because you're saying deep draft navigation and dredging. There's a whole bunch of shallow draft navigation dredging, and then there's a whole bunch of recreational draft dredging that federally you don't look at, maybe, or the port authorities, but all the local municipalities that, like Intercoastal Waterway, and that's a federal dredging. But all the local places have dredging, and even Suffolk County out Long Island has a dredging disposal plan. So it's not the dredging problem. They know where they need to dredge, they just don't know where to put it. So it's like, when you ask that, it's like how many waterways to dredge? If you include that, it's going to be a lot more than just what you're looking at for deep draft.
You can't get an accurate sample set because lots of states and regions aren't dredging because they have no disposal. In Connecticut, if you were to look at that, you'd get a 0 from that. But Connecticut needs to dredge desperately, but they have no place to take it. So it's a flawed question.
So
try again.
which leads to sort of the final thing, and which is that hockey stick graph that Roger showed, right? And particularly, I noticed on the graph that you had a dot for the per capita for the United States, and then a dot for the per capita of the rest of the world. So the rest of the world is, on average, doing far less dredging than the States.
Well, far less earth moving.
Far less earth moving, in general.
And dredging not included. So if anybody can come up with a way of making a ballpark estimate of the amount of earth actually moved in dredging, I would really love to talk to you.
I think that's a good place to end. Brett, are you looking at me because you want to say?
Well, I just had one question. I'll take it back to the end. Sort of a quick question, yes or no. Maybe, there's all these different definitions of what the Anthropocene is. One of them is maybe an awareness of our own impact, the effect of that impact. And I've heard a lot of talk about, potential limits that we have, whether it's actually doing the dredge work, whether it's the cost of the dredge work, whether it's if we're in competition with natural forces. There's also, I think you brought up some political dimensions and how that might work as well. So there's these challenges or limits. So would it be a fair thing to say that dredging in general, where it's innovating, is sort of moving from a kind of blind, reactive process to something that's far more anticipatory, kind of like what you were talking about in the downlands in general, and these filters, these sediment filters and everything, and how that's where the innovation is probably really going to happen, is how we anticipate the effects that we know are going to happen because we kind of know more about what we're doing.
I think that's where, the cost is the signal, right, that you have to start doing something differently. That it's not just sweeping, the rug, but you actually have to think about how you're sweeping the rug and where those sweepings are going. And that the cost really has, made us, I think, be much smarter and to view the material as a resource and not just as a waste product.
Oh, there's another aspect to this question, and that is what is the motivation for dredging? And if you have a resource base which is strong enough and valuable enough, it can support the dredging. If you don't have that resource base, then it won't.
I'll just end too with, I guess, when the mud dump site was closed, everybody was extremely reactionary. And I think after, 17 years have passed, I don't know exactly my math, we should, 15 years? Okay, thanks. We've had a lot of time and a lot of effort into trying to open up those opportunities and shift things so that, we're not as limited, and I think we just have to keep moving towards that and just reiterate the whole using that opportunity for as many beneficial uses as possible while we're cleaning up the estuary to make more of them possible.
I've been doing a lot of discussions with New Jersey DEP and met with Andrew last year about New York. Has there been any additional incentives for landowners for construction of CDFs, private CDFs, and private recycling facilities to dredge in the past year or so, year and a half? I mean, that would be a tremendous thing if the waterfront landowners had some incentive to take this material and to utilize it. Because I know New Jersey is very instrumental in trying to do that right now. I'm speaking kind of about one of my sites. But I was wondering if New York is a little more amenable than it's been in the past, leave it at that. If there's any new programs out there to try and draw people in to say, hey, you're sitting there with your property, let's do something with it.
Well, I think what New York's done, I think the news is that they've established a dredging team at Region 2 at the Department of Environmental Conservation. So there's new kind of staff that's going to focus on dredging. And I guess last year or earlier this year, the DEC did issue approval or set the stage for the approval so that dredge could be brought to a large site on Staten Island, by the Goethals Bridge. And that's more of an issue of the landowner kind of getting its deals done, but they have their permits, which is interesting. Now the permits actually are ahead of the development. So that's probably the biggest one. It's over 100 acres where we'd like to see what you're talking about happen in New York.
So we're out of time, but Michael, I wanted to give you a chance for a final thought or a response to Brett's comments.
I think that my response would be that, again, I'm an advocate for more public engagement with dredging sites. But I think thinking opportunistically, if we look at like the model of fresh kills, right? Taking our municipal garbage, when it reaches capacity, it transitions into a public park. The promise of that is that with public engagement, people will recognize that we're creating waste landscapes through our consumptive habits. And it might trigger a desire in people to do something about that. And the same thing to me holds true with any kind of waste site, dredged waste sites, other landfills. More public engagement, I think, is a pathway towards kind of reconceiving waste as a resource, but also changing habits.
Thank you very much to all the panelists and all the amazing. We're going to take a short break, get up and stretch your legs. We're going to reconvene at 3:15. Thank you very much.